Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly, as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise? Or is the moon hanging outside your window, as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. This is the story of Victorian England's most devastating and hidden epidemic, an epidemic that claimed poets and housewives, factory workers and aristocrats, all while wearing the respectable mask of medicine. By the time this story ends, you'll understand how an entire nation became unknowingly addicted to opium, why doctors were prescribing poison as cure-alls, and how the very fabric of Victorian society was soaked in this amber-colored destruction. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. For decades, no one called it addiction. They called it medicine. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the road to Victorian England's laudanum crisis was paved with the best of intentions. In the early 1800s, pain was an unavoidable companion to daily life. Childbirth was agony. Dental work was torture. A simple headache could ruin your week. Surgery? Well, let us just say that patients were held down by multiple people while surgeons worked as quickly as possible, hoping their patient wouldn't die from shock. Enter laudanum, which seemed like nothing short of a miracle. This liquid contained opium derived from the poppy plant, and when mixed with alcohol, it created a medicine that could banish pain like magic. Suddenly, suffering wasn't inevitable. A few drops of this amber liquid, and the world became bearable again. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Unlike today, where we understand addiction and carefully regulate opiates, Victorian England had no concept of physical dependence. They saw laudanum the way we might see cough syrup, as a helpful medicine that you took when you felt unwell. The idea that your body could become physically dependent on a substance was simply not part of medical understanding. So, when Mrs. Hartwell first started taking her daily tonic for what she called nervous complaints, she had no way of knowing that within weeks, her body would begin to crave it. When she tried to stop, the withdrawal symptoms, the shaking, the sweating, the overwhelming anxiety seemed like her original illness returning with a vengeance. Naturally, she reached for her medicine again and again and again. The tragedy is that she thought she was being responsible. She was following doctor's orders, taking medicine as prescribed, maintaining her health the way a proper Victorian woman should. She had no way of understanding that each dose was making her more dependent, that her medicine was actually feeding a growing monster inside her body. And the doctors? They were just as clueless. When patients returned complaining that their symptoms came back stronger than ever when they stopped their medicine, doctors didn't recognize withdrawal. They saw recurring illness that clearly needed more treatment. So they prescribed larger doses, more frequent doses, stronger concentrations. They were unknowingly creating addicts while believing they were providing compassionate care. This brings us to one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the laudanum epidemic. It particularly devastated women. Victorian society placed enormous pressure on women to be delicate, refined, and perpetually pleasant. Any display of strong emotion, any complaint about pain or discomfort, was seen as feminine weakness that needed to be managed. When a woman suffered from what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, or even the natural pain of childbirth and monthly cycles, the solution was simple. Laudanum. Take Margaret Thornberry, a young mother in Leeds who began taking laudanum after a difficult childbirth in 1855 to help her cope. The medicine helped with the physical pain and the overwhelming feelings she couldn't name, what we might now call postpartum depression. But as months passed, Margaret found she couldn't function without her daily dose. She became irritable and anxious without it, which only confirmed to everyone around her that she was naturally of a nervous disposition and clearly needed her medicine. Margaret's husband, a well-meaning man who loved his wife, encouraged her to take her laudanum regularly. After all, it made her calmer, more pleasant to be around, and better able to manage the household. He had no idea he was watching his wife slowly disappear into addiction. When Margaret began taking larger and larger amounts, when she started hiding bottles around the house, when she became secretive about her doses, her family attributed to the natural progression of her feminine frailty. The cruel irony is that Victorian society's expectations for women made them perfect victims for laudanum addiction. Women were supposed to be passive, quiet, and compliant exactly how laudanum made them behave. A woman on laudanum didn't complain, didn't make demands, didn't cause trouble. She floated through her days in a hazy calm that everyone mistook for proper feminine gentility. But behind the closed doors of Victorian homes, the reality was far different. Women like Margaret were living in a kind of waking nightmare, trapped between the agony of withdrawal and the foggy numbness of being constantly medicated. They lost hours, sometimes entire days, to laudanum-induced stupors. They neglected their children, their households, their own health, all while believing they were taking medicine to help them be better wives and mothers. A medical establishment, dominated entirely by men who had their own ideas about women's experiences, completely failed to recognize what was happening. When women became more dependent on their medicine, doctors saw it as evidence of their inherently weak constitution. When women tried to describe their experiences the way time seemed to slip away, the way they felt disconnected from their own lives, doctors dismissed these as typical feminine hysteria. This brings us to another devastating aspect of the laudanum crisis: children. Victorian parents, with the best of intentions, regularly dosed their children with laudanum for everything from teething pain to restlessness. A fussy baby could be quieted with a few drops of what they called mother's helper. A restless toddler could be calmed with a spoonful of laudanum-laced syrup. Consider the story of little Thomas Wickham, age 3, whose mother gave him regular doses of a popular children's medicine called Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. This supposedly gentle remedy was actually loaded with laudanum. And Thomas, like thousands of children across England, became physically dependent before he could even walk properly. When Thomas became fussy or difficult, his mother naturally reached for the medicine that had always worked before, never understanding that his distress might actually be withdrawal symptoms demanding more of the drug. The tragedy multiplied across generations. Children raised on laudanum grew up with altered brain chemistry, damaged development, and often a lifelong struggle with opiate dependence they never chose and couldn't understand. Some children died from overdoses when well-meaning parents gave them adult doses. Others survived but carried the physical and psychological scars of early addiction throughout their lives. Yet none of this was recognized as a crisis because laudanum was medicine. It was sold openly in pharmacies, grocery stores, even by traveling peddlers. It was cheaper than gin, more socially acceptable than alcohol, and available to anyone with a few pence to spare. Advertisements promised it would cure everything from headaches to heartbreak, from coughs to melancholy. The poetry of the era tells us everything we need to know about how deeply laudanum had penetrated British society. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of England's greatest poets, wrote some of his most famous works while under the influence of laudanum, including the dreamlike Kubla Khan. But Coleridge's relationship with the drug was tormented. He described it as both his muse and his demon, crediting it with inspiring his greatest works, while acknowledging that it was slowly destroying his life, his relationships, and his ability to function. Coleridge's letters reveal the anguish of a brilliant mind trapped by physical dependence he couldn't escape. He wrote about the shame of needing laudanum, about failed attempts to quit, about the way the drug made him feel both superhuman and utterly powerless. His experience was echoed by countless others across Victorian England, from famous artists to anonymous housewives, all struggling with a force they couldn't name or understand. What makes the Victorian laudanum epidemic so particularly tragic is how it was woven into the very fabric of respectability. This wasn't about people seeking intoxication or escape. This was about people trying to be good citizens, good parents, good patients. They were following medical advice, taking care of their health, managing their households responsibly. The fact that their medicine was slowly enslaving them was a truth too horrible and too incomprehensible for Victorian society to face. The epidemic flourished in the shadows of respectability, hidden behind lace curtains and proper manners. Families went bankrupt buying laudanum, but called it medical expenses. Women lost entire years of their lives to opiate stupors, but were praised for their calm demeanor. Children grew up damaged by drugs. Their parents gave them out of love. And through it all, the bottles kept selling, the prescriptions kept flowing, and an entire generation kept drowning in amber liquid while calling it medicine. By the 1870s, something truly sinister was happening in the drawing rooms and bedrooms of Victorian England, something that would make your blood run cold if you could see it happening today. The laudanum habit had evolved from individual tragedy into something far more systematic and devastating. It had become a business model. Picture walking down any high street in Manchester or Birmingham during this period. You'd pass shop after shop advertising their own special laudanum preparations. Dover's powder promised to cure consumption. Godfrey's cordial guaranteed to soothe crying babies. Batley's sedative solution claimed to calm nervous disorders. Each shop had its own secret recipe, its own marketing promises, its own loyal customers who returned day after day for their medicine. But here is what is truly chilling about this commercial explosion. The shopkeepers and manufacturers knew exactly what they were doing. While doctors and patients remained ignorant about addiction, the people selling laudanum had figured out the perfect business model. Create a product that makes customers feel they absolutely must return for more, then market it as medicine so no one questions the dependency. Take the case of Thomas Moy, who owned a chain of chemist shops across the industrial north. Moy's private correspondence, discovered years later, reveals a man who understood addiction better than any doctor of his era. He wrote to his business partner about the importance of maintaining consistent quality in their laudanum preparations, noting that customers became uncommonly distressed when the strength varied. He described certain customers as reliable regulars who could be counted on for daily purchases, rain or shine. Moy wasn't a monster, at least not in his own mind. He genuinely believed he was providing a valuable service to suffering people. But he had also figured out that suffering people who found relief in his products became customers for life. The economics were irresistible. Laudanum cost almost nothing to produce, but could be sold at enormous markups to people who would pay any price rather than go without. The working classes fell into this trap just as completely as the middle classes, but their stories played out differently. In the cramped tenements of industrial cities, entire families shared laudanum bottles the way others might share bread. Factory workers discovered that a morning dose helped them tolerate the brutal conditions of 12-hour shifts in textile mills. Miners found that laudanum dulled not just physical pain, but the psychological terror of descending into dangerous shafts day after day. Consider the story of Sarah Mills, a seamstress in a Manchester garment factory. Sarah's workday began at 5 o'clock in the morning and ended at 8 at night, 7 days a week. The repetitive motions of sewing gave her constant pain in her hands and shoulders, while the dim lighting strained her eyes until they burned. A fellow worker introduced her to laudanum, explaining it as medicine for working folk. Sarah's first dose was a revelation. The pain melted away, replaced by a warm, floating sensation that made even the most tedious work bearable. Colors seemed brighter. Time moved differently, and the harsh voices of the factory supervisors became distant and unimportant. For the first time since childhood, Sarah felt genuinely happy. Within weeks, Sarah discovered she couldn't face work without her morning dose. The pain returned worse than before, but now it was accompanied by a deep, gnawing anxiety that made her hands shake and her stomach churn. She told herself she was ill, that she needed medicine to function. She began taking doses at midday, and again in the evening. Her wages, already barely enough to survive on, were increasingly spent on laudanum rather than food. Sarah's story was repeated thousands of times across industrial England. Workers who had turned to laudanum for relief from brutal working conditions found themselves trapped in a cycle where they needed the drug not just to work, but to exist. They became perfect employees in some ways, docile, uncomplaining, willing to accept any conditions as long as they could maintain their supply of medicine. Factory owners began to notice this pattern, and some actively encouraged it. They allowed laudanum sellers to operate near factory gates, knowing that workers on opiates were less likely to organize, strike, or demand better conditions. It was a form of social control that kept the industrial machine running smoothly, while slowly destroying the people who operated it. The medical establishment, meanwhile, was developing increasingly sophisticated theories about why certain people seemed to need more medicine than others. They created elaborate classifications of constitutional weakness, nervous disorders, and hereditary predispositions to illness. Never once did they consider that the medicine itself might be the problem. Dr. Hamilton Reeves, a prominent physician in Edinburgh, published a paper in 1875 titled, "On the Management of Chronic Nervous Conditions in a Lady's Delicate Constitution." In this paper, he recommended graduated doses of laudanum, carefully calibrated to each patient's specific needs. He noted that some ladies increasingly required frequent doses to maintain their equilibrium, which he attributed to the progressive nature of feminine nervous disorders. Dr. Reeves was actually a compassionate man who genuinely wanted to help his patients. His case notes reveal a physician struggling to understand why his treatment seemed to work initially, but then required constant adjustment. He documented how Mrs. Peyton needed her laudanum every 4 hours, how Miss Hartington became uncommonly agitated if her dose was delayed, how Lady Ashworth had begun requesting house calls at unusual hours when her medicine ran low. What Dr. Reeves was actually documenting was addiction, withdrawal, and drug-seeking behavior. But he interpreted all of this through the medical understanding of his time, seeing it as evidence of underlying illness rather than drug dependence. His prescription records show a steady escalation of doses over time as patients developed tolerance and needed more laudanum to achieve the same effects. The tragedy is that Dr. Reeves and physicians like him were creating the very problems they were trying to solve. Each increase in dosage made patients more dependent. Each new prescription dug them deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. And because the medical establishment refused to recognize addiction as a real phenomenon, they had no tools to help patients who wanted to stop. Some patients did try to quit on their own, with devastating results. Mrs. Catherine Bellwether, the wife of a Yorkshire wool merchant, decided in 1878 that she had become too dependent on her daily laudanum and resolved to stop taking it entirely. Within hours, she was experiencing what she described in her diary as the most dreadful sensations imaginable. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold a pen. Sweat poured from her body despite the cool weather. Most terrifying of all, she felt as though insects were crawling under her skin. Catherine's diary entries during her attempted withdrawal read like horror stories. She wrote about hallucinations that seemed completely real, about panic so intense she couldn't breathe, about physical pain that made her previous ailments seem trivial. After 3 days of agony, she gave up and returned to her laudanum, convinced that she was suffering from some terrible new illness that only her medicine could control. The medical response to cases like Catherine's was to increase the laudanum dose and add other medications to manage what they saw as a severe nervous breakdown. No one understood that Catherine was experiencing withdrawal symptoms that would have eventually passed if she had been properly supported through the process. Instead, her brief attempt at freedom resulted in her becoming more dependent than ever. This pattern repeated itself countless times across Victorian England. People who tried to quit their laudanum on their own faced withdrawal symptoms so severe they became convinced they would die without their medicine. With no medical understanding of addiction or withdrawal, and no support systems to help them through the process, they had no choice but to return to the drug that was slowly destroying their lives. The children growing up in these households were witnessing something they had no words to describe. They saw their mothers disappear into strange, dreamy states for hours at a time. They learned to tiptoe around parents who could shift from loving tenderness to explosive irritability without warning. They grew up understanding that certain bottles in the medicine cabinet were magical substances that could transform the adults in their lives from miserable to content. Young Edmund Hartley, whose mother had been taking laudanum since his birth, later wrote about his childhood memories of finding his mother unconscious in her chair, surrounded by overturned bottles and broken teacups. He described the fear of not being able to wake her, the confusion of having a mother who was physically present but emotionally absent for hours at a time. Edmund learned to fend for himself, to keep quiet when mother was in her sleepy state, and to never, ever touch the special bottles that seemed to control whether his mother was happy or sad. These children were growing up in homes where addiction was normalized, where the rhythms of daily life revolved around dosing schedules and drug availability. Many of them would grow up to develop their own dependencies, having learned from infancy that chemicals were the solution to emotional and physical discomfort. The economic impact of the laudanum epidemic was staggering, though no one at the time calculated it as such. Families went into debt purchasing medicine that cost more per ounce than fine wine. Businesses lost productivity as workers spent increasing amounts of time in opiate-induced stupors. Children grew up neglected and undereducated because their parents were too impaired to provide proper care. Yet all of this destruction was invisible to Victorian society because it was happening under the respectable banner of medical treatment. The woman who spent her family's food money on laudanum was seen as someone who took her health seriously. The man who couldn't function without his morning dose was viewed as someone managing a chronic medical condition. The child who learned to prepare their own meals because mother was often too drowsy to cook was simply growing up in a household dealing with maternal illness. By 1880, an entire generation had grown up thinking this was normal. They had no memory of a time before laudanum, no understanding that families could function differently, no concept that the constant cycle of medication and recovery that dominated their households was actually a form of slow-motion catastrophe. The poets and writers of the era were documenting this catastrophe, though often without fully understanding what they were recording. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote extensively about her laudanum use, describing both the creative inspiration it provided and the terrible hold it had over her life. Her poems contain vivid descriptions of the opiate experience, the way time seemed to stretch and compress, the way ordinary objects took on magical significance, the way reality itself seemed more beautiful and more terrible while under the influence. But Browning also wrote about the darker aspects of her dependency. She described the panic of running low on medicine, the way her entire day revolved around dosing times, the shame of knowing she was controlled by a substance she couldn't live without. Her letters to friends reveal a woman who understood she was trapped but felt powerless to escape. The working class experience was being documented too, though in different ways. Police records from industrial cities show an increasing number of accidents and deaths related to laudanum use. Factory supervisors noted the strange behavior of workers who seemed to sleepwalk through their shifts. Charity workers reported visiting homes where entire families seemed to exist in a perpetual haze, barely able to care for themselves or their children. But perhaps the most telling documentation comes from the account books of laudanum sellers. These records, preserved in various archives, show the steady, relentless growth of the trade throughout the Victorian era, Customer lists grew longer each year. Order quantities increased steadily over time. Repeat customers became the backbone of the business, returning day after day, week after week, year after year for their essential medicine. What makes these account books particularly chilling is how they reveal the mathematics of human misery. A typical customer might start with a weekly purchase of one small bottle. Within 6 months, the same customer was buying 2 bottles. Within a year, they were purchasing daily. The progression was so predictable that experienced laudanum sellers could forecast their income based on how many new customers they acquired each month. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore's purchasing pattern, recorded in the ledgers of Pemberton's Pharmacy in Bath, tells a story that would be repeated thousands of times across England. Her first entry appears in March 1871, bottle of Dover's powder for nervous headaches. By December of the same year, her entries appeared 3 times weekly. By 1873, Adelaide was purchasing laudanum daily, sometimes making multiple trips to the shop when her usual dose failed to provide relief. The pharmacist's notes reveal his growing concern, but also his complete inability to understand what he was witnessing. He wrote that Mrs. Whitmore seemed increasingly delicate and noted that she often appeared quite unwell when she arrived at his shop, only to seem much improved after taking her medicine. What he was actually observing was the cycle of withdrawal and relief that defines addiction, but he interpreted it as proof that his medicine was working exactly as intended. Adelaide's story becomes even more heartbreaking when we examine her family's response to her condition. Her husband, a respectable solicitor, initially supported her medical treatment. He paid her pharmacy bills without question and encouraged her to take whatever medicine she needed to feel well. But as months passed and Adelaide's behavior became increasingly erratic, the family began to adapt in ways that seemed normal at the time, but were actually enabling a devastating addiction. They learned not to disturb Mother during her rest periods after taking her medicine. They accepted that important family decisions would need to wait until Adelaide was feeling herself again. They hired additional household help to manage the tasks that Adelaide could no longer handle during her frequent periods of impairment. Most tragically, they began to see Adelaide's growing dependency not as a medical crisis, but as the natural progression of a delicate constitution that required increasingly careful management. The children in the Whitmore household were growing up thinking this was simply how families functioned. Young Catherine Whitmore, Adelaide's daughter, later wrote in her own diary about learning to gauge her mother's condition by observing subtle signs. The way Adelaide held her teacup, the tone of her voice, the speed of her movements. Catherine became expert at determining whether it was a good day to ask Mother for permission to visit friends, or whether it would be better to wait until after the evening dose of medicine. This adaptation of family life around laudanum schedules was happening in households across every social class in Victorian England. Children learned to be quiet during the hours when parents were resting. Husbands learned to handle business matters without consulting wives who might be too drowsy to make decisions. Servants learned to work around mistresses who could be charming and energetic in the morning, but barely responsive by afternoon. The domestic sphere, which Victorians considered the heart of moral and social stability, was being quietly reorganized around the rhythms of opiate addiction. But because everyone involved believed they were dealing with chronic illness rather than drug dependency, these adaptations seemed not just reasonable, but compassionate. A good family supported an ailing mother by accommodating her medical needs. A loving husband ensured his wife had access to the medicine that kept her comfortable. Devoted children learned not to burden a mother who was already struggling with her health. Meanwhile, the literary world was producing some of its most celebrated works under the influence of laudanum, creating a cultural mythology that made opiate use seem not just acceptable, but almost romantic. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, had established a template for understanding laudanum use as a form of intellectual and artistic enhancement rather than medical treatment. De Quincey wrote rapturously about his opium experiences, describing visions of incredible beauty and insights that seemed to unlock the secrets of the universe. His work created the idea that laudanum could be a key to higher consciousness, a tool for accessing realms of experience unavailable to ordinary minds. This literary romanticization provided cultural cover for what was actually widespread addiction, making it seem sophisticated and even admirable to depend on opiates for daily functioning. But De Quincey also wrote about the darker aspects of his dependency, though these warnings were often overshadowed by his more lyrical descriptions of opiate experiences. He described the terror of withdrawal, the way his entire existence had become organized around procuring and consuming opium, the gradual erosion of his ability to function without the drug. Most chillingly, he wrote about the way opium had changed his relationship with time itself, creating a life where entire days or weeks could disappear into drug-induced stupors. The influence of De Quincey's work extended far beyond literary circles. Middle-class readers who had begun taking laudanum for medical reasons found in his writing a framework for understanding their own experiences. If their medicine sometimes produced strange dreams or altered perceptions, this wasn't a cause for concern, but rather evidence that they were accessing the same elevated states described by celebrated authors. Mrs. Helena Ashworth, the wife of a prominent Manchester textile manufacturer, began keeping a diary in 1876 that reveals how literary ideas about laudanum shaped her understanding of her own dependency. Helena had initially begun taking laudanum for what her doctor described as nervous exhaustion, following the birth of her fourth child. But as her use increased, she began to frame her experiences in terms borrowed from romantic literature about opium. Helena wrote about the exquisite visions that came with her evening dose, describing elaborate fantasies that seemed more vivid and meaningful than ordinary life. She convinced herself that her laudanum use was enhancing her sensitivity and artistic appreciation, making her more capable of understanding beauty and truth. When family members expressed concern about her increasing medication, Helena dismissed their worries as evidence of their own spiritual limitations. This literary framework allowed Helena and countless others to reinterpret the signs of addiction as proof of their refined sensibilities. The fact that they needed increasing amounts of laudanum wasn't tolerance. It was growing spiritual sophistication. The way their thoughts became scattered and dreamlike wasn't impairment. It was enhanced creativity. The panic they felt when their supply ran low wasn't withdrawal. It was evidence of their delicate artistic temperament. But Helena's diary also reveals the devastating practical consequences that no amount of romantic interpretation could disguise. She wrote about losing entire afternoons to laudanum-induced stupors, waking to find her children hungry and her household in chaos. She described the growing isolation as friends and family became uncomfortable with her unpredictable behavior. Most heartbreakingly, she documented the slow erosion of her relationship with her children, who began to treat her with the careful politeness reserved for dangerous invalids. The tragedy of Helena's story is that she genuinely believed she was pursuing a higher form of existence, while actually destroying the life she already had. The literary mythology surrounding laudanum had given her a way to interpret her addiction as a spiritual quest rather than a medical catastrophe. But the end result was the same. A woman who had become a stranger to her own family, trapped in a chemical prison she had learned to call paradise. This pattern of self-deception was repeated throughout Victorian society, enabled by a culture that provided multiple frameworks for understanding laudanum dependency as anything other than what it actually was. Medical professionals called it treatment. Literary figures called it inspiration. Religious leaders, when they addressed it at all, called it a cross to bear. Almost no one called it addiction because the concept simply didn't exist in any meaningful way in Victorian consciousness. The economic structure of Victorian society made the laudanum epidemic even more devastating for working-class families. While middle-class families like the Whitmores could afford to hire additional help to compensate for an impaired parent. Working-class families had no such options. When the primary breadwinner became dependent on laudanum, the entire family faced not just emotional catastrophe, but economic ruin. Consider the case of James Morrison, a skilled carpenter in Birmingham, whose laudanum habit began after a workplace injury crushed 3 fingers on his right hand. The doctor prescribed laudanum for pain management, and initially it seemed like a miracle. James could work despite his injury, supporting his wife Mary and their 3 young children. But as weeks passed, James discovered that his fingers hurt just as much as ever when the laudanum wore off. Worse, he began experiencing anxiety and restlessness that seemed unrelated to his injury, but disappeared completely when he took his medicine. James began taking larger doses more frequently, telling himself he needed stronger medicine to manage his pain. His work began to suffer as he struggled to concentrate during the hours between doses. His formerly steady hands became shaky and unreliable. Customers who had relied on James for quality craftsmanship began taking their business elsewhere, complaining that his recent work seemed careless and unpredictable. Mary Morrison watched her husband's transformation with growing alarm. But like everyone else in Victorian England, she had no framework for understanding what was happening. James seemed to be getting sicker rather than better, despite taking his medicine faithfully. When she suggested he might need a different doctor or a different treatment, James became agitated and defensive, insisting that his medicine was the only thing keeping him functional. The Morrison family's income dropped steadily as James lost customers and took longer to complete projects. But their expenses increased as James needed more and more laudanum to feel normal. Mary began taking in washing to make ends meet, working late into the night while caring for 3 children and trying to manage a household with an increasingly unreliable husband. The children in working-class families, like the Morrisons, faced particular hardships. Unlike middle-class children who might be shielded from the worst effects of a parent-s addiction by servants and extended family, working-class children were directly exposed to the chaos that laudanum dependency created. They went hungry when money that should have bought food was spent on medicine instead. They learned to fend for themselves when parents were too impaired to provide care. They grew up in households where the most basic needs, food, safety, attention, were constantly sacrificed to feed an adult's chemical dependency. Young Tom Morrison, James' eldest son, later wrote about learning to forge his father's handwriting to sign for laudanum deliveries. When James was too incapacitated to leave the house, Tom was 12 years old when he first walked into Hartley's chemist shop, presented a note supposedly from his father requesting his usual bottle of medicine, and walked out with enough laudanum to keep James functional for another day. The pharmacist never questioned these transactions, accepting that chronic invalids often needed family members to collect their medicine. Tom's childhood was spent navigating the unpredictable moods and behaviors of an addicted parent, learning to read the signs that indicated whether his father would be loving and attentive or withdrawn and irritable. He learned to stay out of the house during the worst periods of his father's withdrawal, returning only when he could be sure James had taken his medicine and would be in a relatively stable mood. The impact on children like Tom extended far beyond their immediate family situation. They were growing up with a fundamentally altered understanding of normal family life, adult behavior, and the role of substances in managing emotions and physical discomfort. Many of these children would grow up to develop their own dependencies, having learned from infancy that chemicals were the solution to life's difficulties. The medical establishment, as response to the growing laudanum crisis, was to develop increasingly elaborate theories about constitutional weakness and hereditary predisposition to nervous disorders. When entire families seemed to require regular laudanum treatment, doctors didn't suspect environmental factors or learned behaviors. They concluded that some bloodlines were simply more susceptible to the kinds of ailments that required opiate management. Dr. Mortimer Blackwood, a prominent physician practicing in London's fashionable Mayfair district, published a paper in 1881 titled Hereditary Nervous Diathesis and Its Management in Modern Families. In this work, he argued that certain family lines carried a genetic predisposition to nervous exhaustion that made them dependent on regular medical intervention throughout their lives. Dr. Blackwood's patient records, preserved in medical archives, reveal a man who was actually documenting the intergenerational transmission of addiction while interpreting it as evidence of inherited medical conditions. He treated 3 generations of the Pemberton family, noting how the grandmother's nervous constitution seemed to have been passed down to her daughter and granddaughter, all of whom required daily laudanum to maintain their equilibrium. What Dr. Blackwood was actually observing was a family where children had learned from birth that chemical solutions were the appropriate response to emotional distress, where the rhythms of daily life revolved around medication schedules, and where addiction had been normalized across multiple generations. But his medical training provided no framework for understanding addiction as a learned behavior or recognizing the environmental factors that promoted drug dependency. Instead, Dr. Blackwood prescribed increasingly sophisticated treatment regimens that actually deepened his patients' dependency while making their addiction seem more medically legitimate. He developed elaborate schedules that called for different laudanum preparations at different times of day, supplemented with wine-based tonics and other alcohol-containing medicines that increased the overall level of intoxication while appearing to provide comprehensive medical care. The Pemberton women became some of Dr. Blackwood's most reliable patients, requiring frequent consultations and constant adjustments to their medication regimens. Their case files show a steady escalation of treatment over time, with each generation requiring more intensive intervention than the last. By the 1880s, young Miss Pemberton was taking laudanum 4 times daily, supplemented with additional medications for the anxiety and digestive problems that were actually side effects of chronic opiate use. The tragedy is that the Pemberton family was paying enormous sums for medical care that was systematically destroying their health and their ability to function as independent human beings. They believed they were receiving the finest medical treatment available when they were actually being maintained in a state of chronic intoxication that prevented them from addressing the underlying issues that had originally led them to seek medical help. This pattern was repeated in medical practices throughout England as doctors developed increasingly complex theoretical frameworks to explain why so many of their patients seemed to require lifetime management with opiate-based medicines. The medical literature of the period is filled with elaborate classifications of nervous disorders, constitutional weaknesses, and hereditary predispositions that were actually descriptions of addiction and its effects. But the most chilling aspect of the medical response to the laudanum epidemic was how it created a self-perpetuating system that made recovery virtually impossible for patients who might have wanted to break free from their dependency. Any attempt to reduce laudanum intake was interpreted as a sign that the underlying condition was worsening and required more aggressive treatment. Withdrawal symptoms were seen as proof that the patient's nervous system was too delicate to function without chemical support. The few patients who did manage to communicate their desire to stop taking laudanum entirely were often told by their doctors that such a course would be dangerous or even fatal for someone with their particular constitutional weakness. Medical authority was used to convince patients that their dependency was actually a form of responsible self-care, that attempting to function without their medicine would be a form of reckless endangerment. This medical gaslighting trapped thousands of people in a system where their own instincts about their condition were dismissed in favor of expert opinion that was actually perpetuating their illness. Patients who suspected that their medicine might be causing more problems than it solved were told they were suffering from the very conditions that required more intensive treatment. The result was a medical system that had become a machine for creating and maintaining addiction while convincing everyone involved that it was providing compassionate care for chronic illness. By the mid-1880s, the laudanum epidemic had reached a terrifying new phase. What had begun as individual tragedies was now reshaping the very architecture of Victorian society. Walk through the fashionable districts of London, Edinburgh, or Bath during this period, and you'd witness something that would chill you to the bone if you knew what to look for. Behind every perfectly maintained facade, behind every pristine garden gate and polished brass door knocker, families were quietly disintegrating. The epidemic had become so normalized, so woven into the fabric of respectable life, that entire neighborhoods were functioning as elaborate theater productions, with everyone playing the role of normal while secretly drowning in amber liquid. Take Grosvenor Square in 1884. To any casual observer, it represented the pinnacle of Victorian respectability. Elegant townhouses lined the square, their windows gleaming, their steps scrubbed spotless by an army of servants. Carriages arrived punctually to collect ladies for their afternoon calls. Gentlemen departed each morning for their clubs and offices with military precision. But if you could peer behind those spotless windows, you'd discover that nearly every household on the square was organizing its daily rhythm around laudanum schedules. Mrs. Penelope Ashford at number 12 took her morning dose at precisely 9 o'clock, her midday dose at 1 o'clock, her evening dose at 6. Her neighbors had learned not to call between doses, when Penelope would be either too drowsy to receive visitors or too anxious as her previous dose wore off. Lady Charlotte Pemberton at number 18 had developed an elaborate system of excuses to explain her increasingly erratic behavior. When she missed important social engagements because she'd taken too much laudanum and couldn't wake up, her servants were instructed to say she was suffering from nervous headaches. When she appeared at dinner parties, speaking too rapidly and with unnaturally bright eyes, her friends attributed to her naturally vivacious personality. The Honorable Mrs. Victoria Standish at number 24 had begun hosting what she called recuperative afternoons for ladies suffering from similar nervous complaints. These gatherings were actually group laudanum sessions where respectable women would sit in elegant drawing rooms, sipping their medicine from crystal glasses while discussing literature and charitable works in the dreamy, disconnected tones of the chronically intoxicated. What makes this picture so deeply disturbing is how perfectly it maintained the appearance of normal social life while actually representing the complete breakdown of genuine human connection. These women were going through the motions of friendship, of social engagement, of cultural refinement, but they were doing so from inside chemical bubbles that prevented any real intimacy or authentic interaction. The children growing up in these households were witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the systematic replacement of genuine maternal care with chemically mediated performance. Young Master Edmund Ashford learned that his mother was most likely to respond to his needs during the narrow window between her doses, when she was neither too drowsy nor too anxious to focus on him. He began timing his requests for attention, his questions about lessons, his need for comfort around his mother's medication schedule. Miss Arabella Pemberton discovered that her mother's personality shifted so dramatically throughout the day that she was essentially living with multiple different people in the same body. The morning mother was anxious and irritable, desperate for her first dose. The afternoon mother was dreamy and affectionate, but unable to follow conversations or remember commitments. The evening mother was either cheerfully talkative or completely unconscious, depending on how much medicine she'd taken. These children were developing survival skills that no child should ever need to learn. They became experts at reading the subtle signs of adult intoxication and navigating the unpredictable moods of chemically altered parents, at managing their own emotional needs in households where the adults were fundamentally unavailable. But perhaps most tragically, they were learning that this was simply how families functioned. When young Edmund visited friends whose mothers didn't take daily medicine, he found their households strange and unsettling. The consistent availability of these mothers, their ability to maintain the same personality throughout the day, seemed almost unnatural to a child who had grown up thinking that adults naturally required chemical assistance to function. The servants in these households were becoming unwilling experts in addiction management, though they would never have used such terminology. They learned to recognize the signs that indicated when their mistress had taken too much medicine and would need to be quietly helped to bed. They developed elaborate systems for covering for employers who were too impaired to fulfill their social obligations. Mrs. Dorothy Harrington, head housekeeper for the Ashford family, kept detailed notes about her mistress's condition that read like medical charts, though she thought of them simply as household management records. She noted which days Mrs. Ashford was feeling particularly delicate and would need extra assistance dressing. She tracked which social engagements would need to be canceled due to Mrs. Ashford's recurring nervous complaints. She coordinated with the kitchen staff to ensure that meals were served at times when Mrs. Ashford was most likely to be awake and coherent. Dorothy's records reveal a household staff that had essentially become medical attendants, managing every aspect of daily life around their employer-s addiction, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply caring for a lady with delicate health. They were complicit, not out of malice, but out of loyalty, genuinely believing they were protecting their mistress from the social consequences of her medical condition. The economic impact of this epidemic was staggering in ways that Victorian society refused to acknowledge. The Ashford family was spending more on laudanum each month than most working-class families earned in wages. Mrs. Ashford's medicine cost more per ounce than the finest French champagne, and she was consuming quantities that would have seemed impossible to anyone not familiar with opiate tolerance. But the Ashfords were far from unusual. Account books from fashionable pharmacies show that their wealthiest customers were also their most reliable, returning day after day for increasingly expensive preparations. Harrods department store, catering to London's elite, reported that their pharmaceutical department had become one of their most profitable divisions, with sales increasing by 30% each year throughout the 1880s. The medical establishment had, by this point, developed such sophisticated theoretical frameworks for explaining widespread laudanum dependency that they had essentially created a parallel reality where addiction was impossible by definition. Dr. Algernon Whitmore, physician to some of London's most prominent families, published a treatise in 1885, arguing that what others might mistake for dependency was actually evidence of successful long-term management of chronic constitutional disorders. Dr. Whitmore, as patient notes reveal, a man who had convinced himself that he was witnessing medical triumph rather than widespread addiction. He wrote proudly about patients who had been successfully maintained on laudanum for years, noting how his careful management had allowed them to continue functioning in society despite their underlying nervous conditions. What Dr. Whitmore was actually documenting was his role in maintaining dozens of people in states of chronic intoxication while charging enormous fees for the privilege. His patients weren't functioning in society. They were performing elaborate charades of functionality while being systematically poisoned by the very medicine that was supposed to help them. The most chilling aspect of Dr. Whitmore's records is how they reveal the complete inversion of medical purpose that the laudanum epidemic had created. Instead of helping patients recover from illness, he was helping them adapt to permanent illness. Instead of reducing their need for medical intervention, he was ensuring they would never be able to function without it. Instead of promoting health, he was managing decay. But Dr. Whitmore genuinely believed he was providing compassionate care to people who would otherwise be unable to cope with life's demands. He saw himself as a guardian angel, protecting delicate souls from a world that was too harsh for their sensitive constitutions. The fact that his protection was actually a form of imprisonment was a truth too horrible for him to acknowledge. This medical delusion was shared by practitioners throughout England, creating a professional consensus that made recovery virtually impossible for anyone trapped in the system. Patients who expressed doubts about their treatment were told they were experiencing symptoms of their underlying disorder. Those who tried to reduce their medication were warned they were risking serious mental and physical collapse. The few individuals who did manage to break free from laudanum dependency during this period did so entirely outside the medical system, often through religious conversion or personal crisis that gave them motivation stronger than their physical addiction. But these recoveries were rare and were often attributed by medical professionals to the temporary remission of symptoms rather than genuine cure. Mrs. Constance Fairfax, wife of a prominent barrister, experienced what she later described as a spiritual awakening in 1883 that gave her the strength to endure withdrawal from 15 years of daily laudanum use. Her recovery was so dramatic, she went from being barely functional to becoming actively involved in charitable work, that it challenged everything the medical establishment believed about her condition. But rather than acknowledging that Mrs. Fairfax had recovered from drug dependency, her physician, Dr. Reginald Blackstone, wrote in his notes that she was experiencing a temporary elevation of nervous energy that would inevitably be followed by a more severe relapse requiring more intensive treatment. When months passed and Mrs. Fairfax remained healthy and active, Dr. Blackstone revised his diagnosis, concluding that she had never actually suffered from the severe constitutional weakness he had originally identified. This medical gaslighting extended even to successful recoveries, with doctors rewriting history rather than admitting they had been wrong about the nature of their patients' conditions. The result was a medical system that had become completely closed to evidence that contradicted its fundamental assumptions about laudanum treatment. Meanwhile, the working-class experience of the laudanum epidemic was becoming even more desperate as economic pressures intensified throughout the 1880s. Industrial workers who had become dependent on laudanum found themselves trapped between the impossible choice of spending money they didn't have on medicine or facing withdrawal, symptoms that made work impossible. Consider the story of William Thornton, a dock worker in Liverpool whose laudanum habit had begun after a back injury in 1882. By 1885, William was spending nearly half his wages on medicine, forcing his family to survive on bread and potatoes while he maintained the chemical support he needed to continue working. His wife Martha took in laundry to supplement their income, working 16-hour days to earn money that immediately disappeared into laudanum bottles. The Thornton children were growing up in a household where every decision revolved around their father's need for medicine. When young Alice Thornton fell ill with a fever, the family couldn't afford both medicine for Alice and laudanum for William. Martha faced the impossible choice between caring for her sick child and maintaining her husband's ability to work. She chose to care for Alice, and William spent 3 days in withdrawal, so severe he couldn't leave bed, losing wages the family desperately needed. These kinds of impossible choices were being made in working-class households throughout industrial England. Families were forced to choose between food and medicine, between caring for children and maintaining the adult dependencies that kept money coming in. The psychological impact on children in these families was devastating in ways that would not be fully understood for generations. They were growing up with a distorted understanding of love, responsibility, and family loyalty. They learned that caring for someone meant enabling their addiction, that family resources should be sacrificed to maintain adult chemical dependencies, that children's needs were secondary to the adult's need for drugs. Young Robert Thornton, William's eldest son, began stealing food from market stalls to supplement the family's meager diet, but he never considered stealing his father's laudanum money. He had internalized the family's priorities so completely that he understood his father's medicine as more essential than his own nutrition. When Robert was caught stealing and brought before a magistrate, he could unexplain why he had taken food, but never money, because he could articulate the twisted logic of a household organized around addiction. The religious establishment, as response to the growing laudanum crisis, was complicated by Victorian society's tendency to interpret addiction through moral rather than medical frameworks. When working-class families were destroyed by laudanum dependency, religious leaders often saw it as evidence of moral weakness rather than medical catastrophe. The Reverend Dr. Augustus Peyton, addressing his congregation in Manchester in 1886, delivered a sermon titled "The Wages of Self-Indulgence" that blamed the growing prevalence of what he called medicinal intemperance on the moral failings of individuals rather than the addictive properties of the substances themselves. He argued that people who became dependent on laudanum had failed to develop proper spiritual discipline and were seeking chemical solutions to problems that required moral fortitude. But Reverend Peyton's own household tells a different story. His wife, the refined and pious Mrs. Elizabeth Peyton, had been taking laudanum for nervous complaints since 1880. She attended every church service, led charitable committees, and was universally regarded as a model of Christian virtue. Yet she was consuming laudanum in quantities that would have shocked her husband as parishioners had they known about it. Mrs. Peyton had convinced herself that her laudanum use was actually a form of spiritual discipline, allowing her to transcend physical discomfort and focus on higher purposes. She interpreted the euphoric effects of her medicine as evidence of divine grace, and the anxiety she felt when doses were delayed as spiritual testing. Her addiction had been so thoroughly integrated into her religious worldview that she experienced it as a form of devotion rather than dependency. The contradiction between Reverend Peyton's public condemnation of medicinal intemperance and his private acceptance of his wife as daily laudanum consumption reveals the profound cognitive dissonance that the epidemic had created throughout Victorian society. Sane behaviors that were condemned as moral failings in the working classes were accepted as medical necessities in respectable households. This class-based interpretation of identical behaviors extended throughout Victorian society. When working-class women spent family money on laudanum, they were seen as selfish and irresponsible. When middle-class women did exactly the same thing, they were viewed as taking proper care of their health. The substance was the same, the behaviors were the same, the consequences were the same, but the social interpretation was completely different based on the economic status of the user. The double standard was maintained through elaborate systems of linguistic and social coding that allowed respectable society to distinguish between identical behaviors based on the class status of the people involved. Middle-class laudanum use was medical treatment, while working-class laudanum use was self-indulgence. Middle-class women who couldn't function without their daily doses were suffering from nervous complaints, while working-class women in identical situations were displaying moral weakness. This linguistic sleight of hand allowed Victorian society to maintain its moral certainty while ignoring the epidemic that was destroying families across all social classes. It created a system where the same behaviors were simultaneously condemned and celebrated, depending entirely on the social status of the people involved. By 1887, the laudanum epidemic had reached such proportions that it was beginning to affect Victorian society's basic institutions. Schools reported increasing numbers of children whose erratic attendance and strange behaviors suggested problems at home that teachers couldn't identify or address. Churches found their congregations increasingly populated by people who seemed spiritually present but emotionally absent. Businesses struggled with employees whose productivity fluctuated wildly for reasons that seemed mysterious to their employers. The Bank of England issued a confidential memo in 1887, expressing concern about the increasing number of financial irregularities that seemed to be connected to what they termed medical expenses of unusual magnitude. Bank managers had begun to notice patterns where otherwise reliable customers would suddenly begin withdrawing large sums for medical purposes, followed by erratic financial behavior that suggested impaired judgment. Mr. Geoffrey Worthington, manager of the prestigious Curtis Bank, documented several cases of prominent customers whose financial affairs had become increasingly chaotic in ways that correlated with their medical expenses. Lord Peyton had withdrawn nearly £1,000 over 6 months, all of it documented as payments to various medical practitioners and pharmaceutical suppliers. His account showed the telltale pattern of someone whose judgment had been compromised by chronic intoxication, impulsive purchases, forgotten obligations, and financial commitments that seemed to have been made without proper consideration. But bank managers, like everyone else in Victorian society, had no framework for understanding addiction as a medical condition that could impair judgment and decision-making. They interpreted their customers' erratic behavior as evidence of underlying business problems or family difficulties, never suspecting that the medical expenses themselves might be the cause rather than the consequence of financial instability. The legal system was similarly blind to the role that laudanum dependency was playing in the increasing number of domestic disputes, property disagreements, and contract violations that were appearing in Victorian courts. Judges and lawyers had no understanding of how chronic intoxication could impair someone's ability to fulfill legal obligations or make sound decisions about important matters. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth found herself in court in 1888, sued by a dressmaker for failing to pay for an elaborate wardrobe she had ordered but couldn't remember commissioning. The evidence showed that Mrs. Ashworth had indeed placed the order and had even attended multiple fittings, but she had no memory of these events because they had occurred during periods of laudanum-induced stupor. The judge in Mrs. Ashworth's case was faced with evidence that she had clearly entered into a legal contract, but seemed genuinely unable to remember doing so. Without any understanding of how opiates could affect memory and judgment, he concluded that Mrs. Ashworth was either lying to avoid her obligations or suffering from some form of mental illness that made her testimony unreliable. The case was eventually settled out of court, but it illustrates how the laudanum epidemic was creating legal problems that the Victorian justice system had no tools to understand or address. People were entering into contracts, making major decisions, and taking on significant obligations while in states of chemical impairment that made informed consent impossible. But the legal system had no concept of impairment that didn't involve obvious intoxication with alcohol. The insurance industry was beginning to notice patterns that suggested something was systematically wrong with the health and longevity of their policyholders, but they interpreted these patterns through the medical understanding of their era rather than recognizing them as evidence of widespread addiction. The Phoenix Life Assurance Company noted in their 1888 annual report that claims for what they termed nervous exhaustion and related disorders had increased by 40% over the previous 5 years. They attributed this increase to the stresses of modern life and the particular susceptibility of refined individuals to nervous complaints, never suspecting that they were actually documenting the health consequences of chronic opiate use. Life insurance companies began charging higher premiums for policies on individuals who required regular medical treatment for nervous disorders, unknowingly penalizing people for being victims of medical addiction. They developed elaborate questionnaire designed to identify applicants with constitutional weaknesses that might make them poor insurance risks, inadvertently creating a system that discriminated against people who had become dependent on the very medical treatments that were supposed to help them. The cumulative effect of all these institutional responses was to create a society-wide system of denial that made it virtually impossible for anyone to recognize the laudanum epidemic for what it actually was. Every institution, medical, legal, financial, religious, educational, had developed explanations for the strange behaviors and tragic outcomes they were witnessing that avoided acknowledging the role of addiction in creating these problems. This institutional blindness wasn't the result of conspiracy or deliberate cover-up. It was the natural consequence of a society that lacked the conceptual tools to understand addiction as a medical condition. Without that understanding, every institution was forced to interpret the evidence of widespread laudanum dependency through frameworks that made sense within their existing worldview, but that systematically obscured the true nature of what they were observing. The result was a society that was simultaneously documenting and ignoring one of the most devastating public health crises in human history. The evidence was everywhere, in medical records, court documents, financial records, school attendance reports, church registries, insurance claims. But it was scattered across so many different institutional contexts that no one could see the larger pattern. Individual families knew they were struggling with problems they couldn't understand or solve. Individual doctors knew they had patients whose conditions seemed to worsen despite continuous treatment. Individual teachers knew they had students whose home situations seemed increasingly chaotic. Individual bank managers knew they had customers whose financial judgment seemed increasingly impaired. Individual judges knew they were seeing more cases involving people who seemed unable to remember their own actions or fulfill their obligations. But none of these individuals could see how their separate observations were all pieces of the same devastating puzzle. The laudanum epidemic was hiding in plain sight, documented in thousands of individual records, but invisible as a social phenomenon, because Victorian society had no way to connect the dots between all these separate institutional observations. By the end of the 1880s, an entire generation had grown up thinking that the strange, disconnected, chemically mediated existence they were witnessing in their families and communities was simply the normal human condition. They had no memory of a time before laudanum, no understanding that families could function differently, no concept that the constant cycle of medication and crisis that dominated their world was actually an aberration rather than the natural order of things. The transformation was so complete, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life, that by 1890, Victorian England had essentially created two parallel realities. In one respectable reality, families maintained their social obligations, attended church services, and participated in the life of their communities with clockwork precision. In the other reality, these same families were slowly disintegrating behind closed doors, their daily existence revolving around the careful management of chemical dependencies that no one dared name. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood discovered this terrible duality in the most personal way when she inherited her mother's estate in 1889. Cordelia had always admired her mother as seemingly effortless grace, her ability to manage a large household while maintaining an active social calendar and supporting numerous charitable causes. Lady Margaret Blackwood had been the epitome of Victorian womanhood, refined, cultured, and apparently blessed with the kind of natural equilibrium that allowed her to glide through life's challenges with enviable serenity. But when Cordelia began sorting through her mother's personal effects, she made a discovery that shattered her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her family. Hidden throughout the house, tucked behind books in the library, in secret boxes in the wardrobe, concealed in compartments of her writing desk, were dozens upon dozens of empty laudanum bottles. Some were elegant crystal decanters from fashionable pharmacies. Others were simple brown glass bottles with handwritten labels. A few were tiny vials that could be hidden in a lady's reticule for discreet dosing during social engagements. The sheer quantity was staggering. Cordelia calculated that her mother had been consuming enough laudanum each day to render an ordinary person unconscious. Yet Lady Margaret had maintained the appearance of perfect functionality right up until her death from what the doctor termed natural decline of the nervous system. The woman Cordelia had known as her mother had been, in essence, a masterful performance delivered by someone in a constant state of chemical alteration. More disturbing still were the detailed journals Lady Margaret had kept, documenting her daily doses with the precision of a scientist conducting experiments. The entries revealed a woman who had developed an almost supernatural awareness of her body's responses to different preparations, different timings, different combinations of laudanum with wine or other medicines. She had become a connoisseur of her own intoxication, able to calibrate her chemical state with extraordinary precision to match the demands of different social situations. For morning calls on friends, Lady Margaret noted that she preferred a light dose taken with coffee, which allowed her to be sociable and engaged without the risk of saying something inappropriate. For evening dinner parties, she favored a stronger preparation that would carry her through several hours of conversation, while maintaining what she called agreeable vivacity. For charitable committee meetings, where she needed to appear both compassionate and capable of handling business matters, she had developed a complex regimen involving multiple smaller doses, timed to provide sustained alertness without obvious impairment. Reading the journals, Cordelia realized that every interaction she had ever had with her mother had been mediated by laudanum. Every conversation, every piece of maternal advice, every expression of love had come from a woman whose consciousness was fundamentally altered by opiates. The mother she mourned had never actually existed in an unaltered state. But perhaps most chilling of all was Lady Margaret's complete lack of awareness that anything was wrong with her situation. Her journal entries read like the notes of someone managing a chronic medical condition with admirable discipline and intelligence. She wrote about adjusting her doses to account for changes in weather, social obligations, and what she termed her constitutional fluctuations with the matter-of-fact tone of someone monitoring blood pressure or managing diabetes. There was no recognition that her elaborate system of chemical management had consumed her entire existence, no acknowledgement that she had become a prisoner of her own medicine cabinet. Lady Margaret's journals revealed a woman who believed she had discovered the secret to graceful living, who saw her laudanum regimen as evidence of her sophisticated understanding of her own constitution. Cordelia found herself mourning not just the death of her mother, but the realization that she had never actually known the woman who had raised her. Every memory of maternal guidance, every recollection of family warmth, every cherished moment of connection now seemed suspect. Had her mother's apparent wisdom been the product of opiate-induced detachment? Had her gentle temperament been chemically manufactured? Had their entire relationship been built on a foundation of pharmaceutical illusion? The discovery forced Cordelia to re-examine her own relationship with medicine, and what she found terrified her. She realized that she had inherited not just her mother's estate, but her mother's medicine cabinet, and, more disturbingly, her mother's casual relationship with laudanum. Cordelia had been taking what she considered occasional doses for headaches and monthly discomfort, never questioning why these ailments seemed to be occurring more frequently, or why her usual dose seemed less effective than it once had been. Looking at her mother's journals with new understanding, Cordelia could trace the exact progression of addiction that had consumed Lady Margaret's life. It had begun with precisely the same symptoms, the same casual dosing, the same gradual increase in frequency and strength that Cordelia now recognized in her own behavior. She was following in her mother's footsteps with terrifying precision, and she had been doing so without any conscious awareness of the path she was walking. The realization that she was potentially facing the same fate that had claimed her mother's authentic existence filled Cordelia with a determination that few people of her era possessed. She decided to stop taking laudanum entirely, despite having no medical support or understanding of what she was attempting. Her withdrawal was a nightmare that lasted for weeks, filled with physical agony and psychological torment that she endured in complete isolation, telling her household staff that she was suffering from a particularly severe bout of nervous exhaustion. But Cordelia's successful recovery allowed her to see Victorian society with eyes that had been cleared of chemical fog, and what she observed horrified her. She began to recognize the signs of laudanum dependency everywhere she looked, in every social circle she moved through, in every family she visited. The subtle indicators that she had once attributed to natural variations in personality and temperament now revealed themselves as the telltale signs of people managing different stages of opiate addiction. Mrs. Peyton's famous nervous headaches that required her retire early from social engagements were actually withdrawal episodes. Lady Ashworth's reputation for brilliant conversation that would suddenly turn rambling and incoherent marked the transition from therapeutic doses to excessive consumption. Miss Hartwell's dreamy, otherworldly demeanor that made her so popular with romantic young men was the result of chronic opiate intoxication that everyone mistook for natural artistic sensibility. Cordelia began to understand that she was living in a society where authentic human interaction had become increasingly rare, where most social encounters were actually meetings between people in various states of chemical alteration. The drawing room conversations, the literary salons, the charitable committees that formed the backbone of Victorian cultural life were being conducted by people whose personalities had been fundamentally modified by substances they didn't understand. The poets and writers who were celebrated for their sensitivity and artistic vision were, in many cases, simply people whose creative output had been shaped by chronic opiate use. The gentle, refined ladies who were held up as models of feminine virtue were often women whose apparent serenity was chemically manufactured. The wise, thoughtful gentlemen whose opinions carried social weight were frequently making their pronouncements from within chemical bubbles that disconnected them from reality. But Cordelia also realized that she was virtually alone in her recognition of this situation. The few attempts she made to discuss her concerns with friends and family members were met with polite incomprehension or gentle suggestions that she might be suffering from nervous strain herself. Victorian society had no language for describing addiction, no framework for understanding chemical dependency, no way of recognizing that what they considered normal medical practice was actually systematic poisoning. The isolation of her newfound awareness was almost unbearable. Cordelia found herself attending social gatherings where she was the only person present who was not under the influence of opiates, listening to conversations conducted by people whose consciousness had been fundamentally altered by substances they considered medicine. She felt like she was living among sleepwalkers, watching people go through the motions of normal social interaction while being completely disconnected from authentic experience. This sense of isolation was compounded by the realization that her own family's history was probably typical rather than exceptional. If Lady Margaret had managed to hide her massive laudanum consumption so completely that even her own daughter hadn't suspected it, how many other families were harboring similar secrets? How many other children were growing up thinking that the strange, disconnected behavior they witnessed at home was simply normal family life? Cordelia began to pay attention to the children in her social circle with new understanding, and what she observed broke her heart. She saw young people who had learned to navigate the unpredictable moods of chemically altered parents with survival skills that no child should need to develop. She watched them adapt to households where the rhythms of daily life revolved around adult dosing schedules, where emotional availability fluctuated based on medication timing, where basic needs were often sacrificed to maintain chemical dependencies. Young Master Edmund Fairfax had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict his mother's behavior based on subtle physical cues that indicated whether she was approaching withdrawal or had recently taken her medicine. He had learned to time his requests for attention, his need for comfort, his questions about daily activities around his mother's chemical cycles. At age 12, he was essentially managing his mother's addiction while she remained completely unaware that anything required management. Miss Arabella Thornton had grown up thinking that all mothers disappeared into dreamy, unreachable states for hours at a time, that whole families organized their activities around mysterious bottles that adults needed to feel well. When she visited friends whose mothers remained consistently present and engaged throughout the day, she found their households strange and unsettling. The reliable availability of these unmedicated mothers seemed almost unnatural to a child who had learned that adults naturally required chemical assistance to function. These children were developing coping mechanisms that would shape their understanding of relationships, responsibility, and emotional regulation for the rest of their lives. They were learning that love meant enabling dysfunction, that caring for someone required accommodating their chemical needs above all other considerations, that normal family life involved constant adaptation to the unpredictable behavior of impaired adults. But they were also learning that these adaptations were secrets that couldn't be discussed outside the family. The shame and secrecy that surrounded addiction, even when it wasn't recognized as such, taught children that their family's strange dynamics were private matters that would reflect poorly on everyone involved if they became known to outsiders. The result was a generation of young people who were becoming expert at maintaining facades of normalcy while managing chaos behind closed doors. They learned to lie convincingly about why their parents missed social obligations, to make excuses for erratic behavior, to cover for adults who were too impaired to fulfill their responsibilities. They became accomplished actors, performing the role of children from normal families while actually serving as caretakers for addicted adults. Cordelia's growing awareness of these patterns filled her with a sense of urgency about the need to document what she was witnessing. She began keeping detailed journals of her own observations, creating what may have been the first systematic documentation of Victorian society as laudanum epidemic, from the perspective of someone who understood what she was actually looking at. Her journals describe a society in the grip of a public health crisis that it couldn't recognize or acknowledge. She documented the elaborate systems of denial that allowed families to maintain respectability while slowly disintegrating. She recorded the linguistic gymnastics that transformed identical behaviors into either medical treatment or moral failure, depending on the social class of the people involved. She chronicled the institutional blindness that prevented doctors, lawyers, educators, and religious leaders from connecting the evidence of widespread addiction that was scattered throughout their professional observations. But Cordelia also documented the human cost of this epidemic in terms that reveal the true tragedy of what was happening to Victorian families. She wrote about marriages that had become elaborate performances conducted between people who were never simultaneously present in unaltered states. She described parent-child relationships that existed entirely within the context of chemical dependency, where authentic emotional connection had been replaced by the management of addiction-related behaviors. Most heartbreakingly, she documented the loss of what she called genuine in people's lives. She wrote about women whose intelligence, possibility, and creativity had been buried under decades of opiate fog, about men whose potential for meaningful work and relationships had been sacrificed to the demands of maintaining chemical equilibrium, about children whose development had been distorted by growing up in households organized around adult drug dependencies. Cordelia's journals reveal a woman who understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the systematic replacement of authentic human experience with chemically mediated performance on a society-wide scale. She was documenting the slow-motion destruction of an entire culture's capacity for genuine connection, meaningful work, and authentic emotional expression. But her documentation was also a form of resistance against the collective amnesia that the epidemic had created. By recording what she was seeing with clear eyes and honest language, Cordelia was preserving evidence of a reality that Victorian society was determined to ignore. Her journals stand as testimony to the human cost of addiction denial, to the price paid by families and individuals when societies refuse to acknowledge the destructive power of the substances they embrace as medicine. The isolation of her awareness was compounded by the realization that she was powerless to help most of the people she cared about. Any attempt to discuss addiction with someone who was actively dependent on laudanum was met with the defensive responses typical of people whose survival depends on maintaining their access to substances they can't live without. Friends and family members who might have benefited from understanding their condition were psychologically incapable of hearing information that threatened their continued access to the chemicals that had become essential to their daily functioning. Cordelia found herself in the terrible position of watching people she loved destroy themselves while being unable to offer help that they could accept. She could see the progression of addiction in people who were completely blind to their own condition, could predict the trajectory of their decline with depressing accuracy, but could do nothing to intervene because the very nature of their dependency made them incapable of recognizing that they needed help. This powerlessness was particularly painful when it came to the children in her extended family and social circle. Cordelia could see young people being damaged by growing up in households dominated by addiction. But any attempt to address these issues directly was seen as inappropriate interference in private family matters. The social conventions that protected family privacy also protected the addictive systems that were destroying those families from within. The few times Cordelia attempted to raise concerns about children's welfare with their addicted parents, she was met with responses that revealed how completely addiction had distorted their understanding of their own parenting. Mothers who were barely conscious for hours at a time genuinely believed they were providing excellent care for their children. Fathers who spent family resources on laudanum while their children went without adequate food or clothing saw themselves as responsible providers who were managing necessary medical expenses. The addiction had created a form of psychological blindness that made it impossible for affected parents to see the impact of their behavior on their children. They had developed elaborate systems of rationalization that transformed neglect into proper parenting, reinterpreting their children's adaptive behaviors as evidence of good breeding rather than survival responses to household dysfunction. Cordelia began to understand that the children growing up in these households were developing not just individual coping mechanisms, but a collective adaptation to living in a society where authentic adult guidance was increasingly rare. They were learning to raise themselves, to make important decisions without reliable adult input, to navigate complex social situations without the benefit of parents who were consistently present and emotionally available. This generational impact of the laudanum epidemic was perhaps its most devastating long-term consequence. An entire cohort of young people was growing up with fundamentally altered understandings of normal human relationships, family responsibility, and emotional regulation. They were learning that adults naturally required chemical assistance to function, that family life naturally involved constant adaptation to unpredictable behavior, that authentic emotional expression was something to be managed and controlled rather than experienced and shared. These children would grow up to become the parents of the next generation, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about family life, emotional management, and the role of substances in daily existence. They would pass on not just genetic predispositions to addiction, but psychological and social patterns that normalized chemical dependency and made recovery increasingly difficult for future generations. Cordelia's journals document her growing understanding that she was witnessing not just an epidemic of individual addiction, but a fundamental transformation of Victorian society's capacity for authentic human connection. The laudanum crisis was creating a culture where genuine intimacy, honest communication, and authentic emotional expression were becoming increasingly rare, replaced by chemically mediated performances that maintained the appearance of normal social functioning while actually representing the systematic breakdown of meaningful human relationships. By 1891, Cordelia had documented enough evidence to understand that the laudanum epidemic represented a form of social catastrophe that was unprecedented in human history. Never before had an entire society systematically altered its consciousness on such a massive scale while remaining completely unaware of what it was doing to itself. Never before had a culture so thoroughly replaced authentic human experience with chemical simulation while continuing to believe that it was maintaining normal social and family life. But Cordelia also understood that her documentation would probably never be read or understood by her contemporaries. Victorian society had invested too heavily in its system of denial to acknowledge evidence that contradicted its fundamental assumptions about medicine, family life, and social respectability. The truth about the laudanum epidemic was too threatening to existing power structures, too damaging to professional reputations, too destructive to family mythologies to be accepted by people who had built their identities around maintaining these illusions. Her journals would have to serve as testimony for future generations, as evidence of what had actually happened during this period of history when an entire society had lost its way in a pharmaceutical fog. She was creating a record for people who might someday have the conceptual tools to understand what Victorian England had done to itself, even though her own contemporaries were psychologically incapable of facing that reality. The weight of this knowledge, The isolation of being perhaps the only person in her social circle who could see what was actually happening began to take its toll on Cordelia's own mental health. She found herself questioning her sanity, wondering whether her perceptions were accurate or whether she was suffering from some form of delusion that made her see addiction where others saw normal medical treatment. The gaslighting was systematic and overwhelming. Every institution, every authority figure, every social convention reinforced the idea that laudanum use was normal, healthy, and appropriate. Cordelia's contrary perceptions were constantly challenged by a society that had enormous investments in maintaining its delusions about the substances that had become central to its functioning. But Cordelia's journals also reveal a woman who refused to surrender her clarity despite the enormous social pressure to conform to collective denial. She continued documenting what she observed, continued analyzing the patterns she detected, and continued bearing witness to a reality that her society was determined to ignore. Her persistence in maintaining her own version of truth, despite being surrounded by people who were living in chemically altered versions of reality, represents a form of heroism that was probably unique to her historical moment. By the early 1890s, Cordelia had documented enough evidence to understand that the laudanum epidemic was not just destroying individual lives and families, but was systematically undermining the foundations of Victorian civilization itself. The elaborate social structures that defined respectability, the cultural institutions that maintained continuity across generations, the economic systems that depended on reliable human judgment and behavior were all being slowly corrupted by the widespread use of substances that altered consciousness in ways that no one understood or acknowledged. The most insidious aspect of what Cordelia was documenting wasn't just the individual tragedies, but how the laudanum epidemic was systematically rewiring the very DNA of Victorian social interaction. By 1892, she had identified what she privately called the performance protocols, elaborate behavioral scripts that allowed people in various stages of opiate intoxication to navigate social situations without revealing their condition. Take the phenomenon of visiting hours. Cordelia observed that fashionable ladies had unconsciously synchronized their social calendars around their medication schedules. Morning calls occurred between 11 and noon, precisely when most laudanum users experienced their daily peak of artificial alertness. Afternoon teas were scheduled for 4 o'clock, allowing hostesses time to take their second dose while guests traveled between engagements. Evening entertainments began no earlier than 8, ensuring that all participants had achieved their optimal level of chemical equilibrium for sustained social performance. What appeared to be the natural rhythm of polite society was actually a carefully orchestrated dance around collective addiction. Though none of the participants understood this choreography, they simply knew through trial and error when they felt most capable of social interaction, and when they preferred to remain at home with their delicate constitutions. Mrs. Beatrice Montrose had perfected what Cordelia recognized as the laudanum hostess performance. Beatrice could conduct an entire dinner party for 12 guests while consuming enough opium to render an ordinary person unconscious, maintaining animated conversation about literature and politics while her pupils remained pinpoints, and her movements took on the careful, deliberate quality of someone navigating through invisible obstacles. Beatrice's dinner parties became legendary for their sophisticated atmosphere and brilliant conversation. But Cordelia now understood that this brilliance was chemically manufactured. The wit was sharper, the insights more profound, the emotional connections more intense, because everyone present was operating under the influence of substances that remove normal social inhibitions while creating artificial feelings of intimacy and understanding. The conversations at these gatherings had a particular quality that Cordelia learned to recognize. They were simultaneously more personal and less authentic than normal social discourse. People shared intimate thoughts and feelings with unusual openness. But these revelations came from chemically altered states rather than genuine emotional connection. The apparent depth of friendship and understanding that developed at such gatherings was built on pharmaceutical foundations that made real intimacy impossible. Young Lord Peyton, a regular at Beatrice's salon, would arrive punctually at 8:30, having timed his evening dose to coincide with the expected duration of the evening's entertainment. He became known for his passionate recitations of poetry and his ability to discuss complex philosophical questions with remarkable eloquence. But Cordelia observed that Peyton's insights, while seemingly profound, followed predictable patterns that reflected the cognitive effects of chronic opiate use: grandiose thinking, emotional intensity without genuine feeling, and the kind of artificial profundity that feels meaningful to people under the influence, but reveals itself as empty rhetoric when examined in sobriety. The literary output of this period was being shaped by these chemical influences in ways that would have shocked Victorian readers had they understood what they were actually celebrating: the dreamy romanticism, the elaborate emotional landscapes, the sense of otherworldly beauty that characterized so much Victorian poetry and prose weren't just artistic choices. They were the direct result of writers creating while under the influence of substances that fundamentally altered their perception of reality. Consider the case of Miss Evangeline Hartwell, whose delicate verses about love and loss had made her something of a celebrity in London literary circles. Evangeline's poetry captured what critics praised as an almost supernatural sensitivity to beauty and pain, an ability to find profound meaning in the smallest details of human experience. Her readings at fashionable literary gatherings drew audiences who wept openly at her descriptions of emotional and spiritual transcendence. But Cordelia's careful observation revealed that Evangeline's supernatural sensitivity was actually the result of chronic laudanum use that had begun as treatment for what doctors called artistic temperament. The intense emotions that infused her poetry weren't authentic feelings, but chemically induced states that she had learned to channel into her writing. The otherworldly quality that made her work so moving to contemporary readers was the direct result of a consciousness that had been fundamentally altered by opiates. Evangeline's creative process had become entirely dependent on her chemical state. She could only write during the narrow window when her laudanum dose provided maximum euphoria without complete incapacitation. Her most celebrated poems were composed during these chemically induced periods of artificial inspiration, when ordinary experiences took on the heightened significance that characterizes opiate intoxication. The tragedy was that Evangeline genuinely believed her laudanum was unlocking her natural artistic gifts rather than replacing them with artificial substitutes. She had no memory of what her unaltered consciousness felt like, no basis for comparison that might have allowed her to recognize that her celebrated sensitivity was actually a form of cognitive impairment that created the illusion of enhanced perception while actually disconnecting her from authentic experience. The audiences who attended Evangeline's readings were equally unaware that they were witnessing chemically manufactured art. They praised her work for its spiritual depth and emotional authenticity, never suspecting that both the creation and the reception of it were mediated by substances that made genuine spiritual or emotional connection impossible. The entire literary culture of the period was being shaped by the collective, unconscious influence of laudanum, creating art that seemed profound to people who were themselves under chemical influence, while actually representing a systematic departure from authentic human expression. This chemical mediation of cultural production extended far beyond poetry into every aspect of Victorian intellectual and artistic life. The philosophical discussions that took place in fashionable salons, the theological debates that shaped religious thought, the political conversations that influenced social policy, were all being conducted by people whose consciousness had been fundamentally altered by substances they did not understand. Dr. Reginald Ashworth, a prominent theologian whose sermons on spiritual transcendence drew crowds from across London, had developed his entire theological framework while under the influence of laudanum, which he took for what he called the burden of spiritual sensitivity. His famous lectures on the nature of divine experience were actually descriptions of opiate-induced states that he interpreted as religious revelation. His followers, many of whom were also laudanum users, found his teachings profoundly moving because they recognized, without understanding why, the consciousness he was describing. The result was a form of collective religious delusion where chemical experiences were being interpreted as spiritual truths and passed down as authentic theological insight. Dr. Ashworth's influence extended throughout the Anglican Church, shaping doctrine and practice in ways that reflected the cognitive distortions of chronic opiate use rather than genuine spiritual understanding. The political implications were equally disturbing. Members of Parliament, judges, and civil servants were making decisions that affected millions of lives while under the influence of substances that impaired their judgment in ways they couldn't recognize. The famous compromise legislation of the 1890s, praised by historians for its nuanced approach to complex social problems, was actually the product of minds that were chemically incapable of the kind of clear thinking that effective governance requires. Lord Justice Peyton's landmark legal decisions, celebrated for their humanitarian sensitivity and philosophical sophistication, were made by a man who consumed laudanum in quantities that would have made rational analysis impossible. His rulings reflected the grandiose thinking and artificial empathy characteristic of opiate intoxication rather than genuine legal wisdom. But they were praised by contemporaries who were themselves operating under similar chemical influences. The economic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore, even for a society committed to collective denial. The Bank of England's confidential reports from this period document a pattern of increasingly erratic financial behavior among the nation's elite that they attributed to the peculiar pressures of modern commercial life, rather than recognizing it as evidence of widespread cognitive impairment due to addiction. Mr. Charles Worthington, managing director of one of London's most prestigious investment firms, had built his reputation on his ability to identify profitable opportunities that others missed. His clients trusted him with enormous sums because of his track record of generating exceptional returns through what seemed like supernatural insight into market conditions. But Cordelia's analysis of Worthington's investment patterns revealed that his celebrated intuition was actually the result of the grandiose confidence and impaired risk assessment that characterizes chronic opiate use. His early successes had been lucky coincidences that reinforced his chemically induced belief in his own extraordinary abilities. His more recent investments showed the increasingly poor judgment typical of someone whose decision-making capacity had been compromised by addiction. But his clients attributed their losses to unavoidable market conditions rather than questioning their advisor's competence. The ripple effects extended throughout the economy as laudanum-impaired decision-makers in positions of authority made choices that reflected chemically distorted perceptions rather than sound business judgment. The speculative bubbles, the overextended credit arrangements, the increasingly complex financial instruments that characterized late Victorian capitalism were all products of minds that were operating under chemical influences that made rational risk assessment impossible. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the epidemic was reshaping the fundamental nature of human relationships across all levels of society. Cordelia documented what she called the intimacy illusion, the way that laudanum created artificial feelings of closeness and understanding that prevented genuine emotional connection, while making people believe they were experiencing deeper relationships than ever before. Marriage had become a particularly tragic casualty of this chemical transformation. Couples who had fallen in love while both were under the influence of laudanum found themselves trapped in relationships built on pharmaceutical foundations that made authentic intimacy impossible. They experienced intense emotional connection during periods of shared intoxication. But this artificial intimacy disappeared when either partner's chemical state fluctuated, leaving them feeling confused and disappointed by their inability to maintain the feelings they remembered. Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Fairmont had been celebrated as one of London's most romantic couples, known for their passionate devotion and their ability to maintain honeymoon-like intensity years into their marriage. But Cordelia's observation revealed that their legendary romance was actually a shared addiction that created the illusion of deep emotional connection while preventing them from ever truly knowing each other as individuals. Their most intimate moments occurred during periods when both had achieved optimal laudanum levels, creating states of artificial euphoria and emotional openness that they interpreted as proof of their extraordinary love. But when their chemical states were misaligned, when one was in withdrawal while the other was intoxicated, or when their tolerance levels required different dosing schedules, they found each other irritating and incomprehensible. They had no understanding that their relationship existed primarily within the context of shared chemical alteration. They attributed their periodic disconnection to natural fluctuations in marital harmony, never suspecting that their capacity for emotional intimacy had been systematically replaced by pharmaceutical simulation. They were performing the roles of devoted spouses while being fundamentally incapable of the authentic connection that genuine love requires. This pattern was repeated in households throughout Victorian England, creating a generation of marriages that existed primarily as elaborate performances conducted between people who never encountered each other in unaltered states. Children growing up in these households learned that love was something that required chemical management, that authentic emotional expression was dangerous and unpredictable, that family harmony depended on everyone maintaining their proper level of chemical equilibrium. The parent-child relationships were particularly heartbreaking in their artificial quality. Laudanum-dependent mothers experienced intense feelings of maternal love during periods of optimal intoxication, showering their children with attention and affection that felt genuinely warm and nurturing. But these periods alternated with times of withdrawal-induced irritability or stupor-induced unavailability, creating a pattern of inconsistent parenting that left children constantly confused about their mother's true feelings toward them. Young Master Timothy Ashworth learned to cherish the brief periods when his mother was in what he thought of as her loving mood, not understanding that these moments of warmth were chemically manufactured and had no connection to her actual feelings about him as a person. He developed elaborate strategies for maximizing these precious intervals, learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicated his mother had achieved the chemical state that made her temporarily capable of maternal affection. But Timothy also learned that attempting to connect with his mother during other periods was not just futile, but potentially dangerous. When she was in withdrawal, his presence irritated her beyond measure. When she was heavily intoxicated, she was incapable of focusing on him long enough to respond to even basic needs. He learned to become essentially invisible during these periods, caring for himself with a competence that was heartbreaking in someone so young. The most tragic aspect of Timothy's situation was that he genuinely believed his mother loved him because he had no way of understanding that her periodic displays of affection were chemically induced performances rather than authentic maternal feelings. He spent his childhood trying to earn more of these moments, never understanding that they had nothing to do with his behavior and everything to do with his mother's dosing schedule. This confusion about the nature of love and affection was being passed down to an entire generation of children who were learning that emotional connection was unpredictable, that adult attention had to be earned through perfect behavior, and that family relationships were fundamentally unreliable. They were developing survival strategies that would shape their understanding of human relationships for the rest of their lives, carrying forward patterns of emotional management that would make authentic intimacy difficult even after they escaped the immediate context of their childhood households. The educational system was being similarly corrupted by the widespread use of laudanum among teachers and administrators. Miss Caroline Whitmore, headmistress of one of London's most prestigious girls' schools, had built her reputation on her ability to bring out the best in her students through what she called sympathetic understanding of the feminine temperament. Parents competed to enroll their daughters in her academy because of her legendary ability to nurture young minds while maintaining the highest standards of academic and moral instruction. But Miss Whitmore, as sympathetic understanding, was actually the result of the artificial empathy and emotional intensity that characterizes chronic opiate use. Her educational philosophy was shaped by the grandiose thinking and spiritual pretensions that laudanum created, leading her to believe she possessed supernatural insight into the needs and potential of her students. The girls under Miss Whitmore's care were being educated by someone whose consciousness had been fundamentally altered by addiction. Though neither they nor their parents understood this, her teaching methods reflected the cognitive distortions of chronic intoxication, emotional intensity without genuine understanding, artificial profundity that seemed wise but actually represented impaired thinking, and the kind of grandiose confidence that comes from chemically manufactured self-esteem rather than genuine competence. The students were learning not just academic subjects, but unconscious lessons about adult behavior, emotional regulation, and the nature of authority from someone who was essentially performing the role of educator while being fundamentally incapacitated by addiction. They were developing their understanding of intellectual and moral standards based on the chemically distorted perceptions of someone who was incapable of authentic judgment, but who seemed to possess extraordinary wisdom and sensitivity. Miss Whitmore's influence extended far beyond her immediate students to shape educational theory and practice throughout England. Her publications on feminine education were widely read and implemented by other schools, spreading teaching methods that reflected the cognitive impairments of addiction rather than genuine pedagogical insight. An entire generation of young women was being educated according to principles that had been developed by minds operating under chemical influence, creating lasting distortions in their intellectual and moral development. The religious establishment was facing similar corruption as laudanum use became widespread among clergy who interpreted their chemically altered states as evidence of heightened spiritual sensitivity. The Reverend Dr. Augustus Pemberton had developed what became known as the Pemberton method of spiritual counseling, which emphasized emotional intensity and mystical experience as evidence of divine connection. Dr. Pemberton's method was actually a direct reflection of his own laudanum-induced spiritual experiences, which he had learned to interpret as authentic religious revelation rather than recognizing them as drug-induced hallucinations. His counseling sessions took place during periods of chemical euphoria that made him feel profound spiritual connection with parishioners he barely knew, leading him to offer guidance based on artificial insights rather than genuine pastoral wisdom. The parishioners who sought Dr. Pemberton's spiritual guidance were receiving counseling from someone whose religious understanding had been systematically distorted by addiction. His famous sermons on transcendent spiritual experience were actually descriptions of opiate intoxication interpreted through religious frameworks, but they resonated powerfully with congregations that included many laudanum users who recognized without understanding why the states of consciousness he was describing. The result was a form of collective religious delusion where chemically induced experiences were being interpreted as authentic spiritual truth and passed down as legitimate theological doctrine. Dr. Pemberton's influence extended throughout the Anglican Church, shaping religious practice and belief in ways that reflected the consciousness-altering effects of addiction, rather than genuine spiritual insight. By 1893, Cordelia had documented enough evidence to understand that virtually every aspect of Victorian civilization was being systematically corrupted by the widespread use of substances that altered consciousness in ways no one acknowledged or understood. The art, literature, philosophy, theology, politics, economics, education, and family life that defined their culture were all being shaped by minds operating under chemical influences that made authentic human experience increasingly rare. But what made this cultural catastrophe particularly devastating was how completely invisible it remained to the people living through it. The chemical alteration had become so normalized, so thoroughly integrated into every aspect of daily life, that people had lost all memory of what unaltered consciousness felt like. They had no basis for comparison that might have allowed them to recognize that their enhanced sensitivity, their profound insights, their intense emotions, and their spiritual experiences were actually symptoms of cognitive impairment rather than evidence of superior human development. The society had created a closed system of chemical delusion where every institution reinforced the others in maintaining collective denial about the true nature of what was happening. The medical establishment provided theoretical frameworks that explained addiction as constitutional weakness. The legal system created precedents that protected the right to pharmaceutical self-medication. The economic system generated enormous profits from substances that created their own demand. The educational system taught children that chemical management of consciousness was normal and healthy. The religious establishment interpreted drug experiences as spiritual revelation. Cordelia understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented in human history, the systematic replacement of authentic human civilization with a chemically mediated simulation that maintained the appearance of normal cultural life while actually representing the complete breakdown of genuine human connection, creative expression, intellectual development, and spiritual growth. An entire society had become addicted not just to specific substances, but to artificial versions of their own consciousness that prevented them from accessing their authentic human potential. The weight of this knowledge, the isolation of being perhaps the only person in her world who could see what was actually happening, had begun to take an almost unbearable toll on Cordelia's mental health. She found not just herself questioning her society, but her own sanity, wondering whether her perceptions were accurate or whether she was suffering from some form of delusion that made her see catastrophe where others saw normal progress and cultural refinement. But her journals also reveal a woman who refused to surrender her clarity despite the enormous psychological pressure to conform to collective delusion. She continued documenting what she observed, continued analyzing the patterns she detected, and continued bearing witness to a reality that her entire civilization was determined to ignore. Her persistence in maintaining her own version of truth, despite being surrounded by people who were living in chemically altered versions of reality, represents a form of intellectual and moral heroism that was probably unique to her historical moment. As 1894 approached, Cordelia had begun to understand that her documentation was not just a record of contemporary events, but a message to future generations who might someday possess the conceptual tools necessary to understand what Victorian England had done to itself. She was creating testimony for people who might eventually develop frameworks for recognizing addiction, understanding its social consequences, and preventing similar catastrophes from occurring in their own societies. Her journals would serve as evidence that not everyone had been blind to what was happening, that at least one person had maintained enough clarity to see through the collective delusion and document the true cost of a society that had lost itself in a pharmaceutical fog. But she also understood that her contemporaries were psychologically incapable of hearing her message too invested in maintaining their chemical dependencies and the social systems that supported them to acknowledge evidence that threatened the foundations of their entire way of life. The laudanum epidemic was approaching its peak, and Cordelia's documentation reveals a civilization that was about to face consequences it was completely unprepared to understand or address. The children who had grown up in households dominated by addiction were becoming adults who carried forward the psychological and social patterns they had learned. The institutions that had been corrupted by widespread chemical influence were beginning to produce results that even collective denial could not explain away. The stage was set for revelations that would force Victorian society to confront truths about itself that it had spent decades avoiding. But whether that confrontation would lead to recovery or deeper delusion remained to be seen. The transformation was about to accelerate in ways that would shake even Victorian society's remarkable capacity for denial. By 1895, the first generation of children who had grown up entirely within the laudanum epidemic were reaching adulthood, and they were bringing with them psychological patterns that would push the crisis into entirely new territory. Consider young William Ashworth, now 23 and recently graduated from Cambridge. William had never known a world without laudanum. His earliest memories were of tiptoeing around his mother during her rest periods of learning to gauge adult moods by observing the subtle signs of chemical states of understanding that family harmony required everyone to maintain their proper pharmaceutical equilibrium. He had absorbed these lessons so completely that they had become the foundation of his understanding of how human relationships functioned. When William took his position as a junior clerk in a prestigious London banking firm, he brought with him assumptions about normal adult behavior that were entirely shaped by his experience with addicted parents. He expected his colleagues to have unpredictable mood swings that correlated with mysterious medical needs. He was prepared to work around supervisors who might be unavailable for hours at a time due to health concerns. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle physical cues that indicated when adults were in states that made productive interaction possible. But William's expectations were met and exceeded by a workplace where laudanum use had become so normalized that it was essentially invisible. His supervisor, Mr. Geoffrey Peyton, maintained what appeared to be remarkable equanimity under pressure, handling complex financial transactions with the kind of serene confidence that impressed clients and colleagues alike. What William didn't initially understand was that Mr. Pemberton's legendary calm was chemically manufactured, the result of carefully timed doses that kept him in a state of opiate-induced detachment from the stress and complexity of his responsibilities. The banking firm had unconsciously organized its daily operations around the collective medication schedules of its senior staff. Important meetings were scheduled for mid-morning, when most participants had achieved their optimal chemical balance. Complex decisions were deferred to late afternoon, after everyone had taken their second dose of the day. The famous gentlemen's agreements that characterized London financial circles were actually negotiations conducted between people whose judgment had been systematically impaired by substances they considered medicine. William's initiation into this world was gradual and seemed entirely natural to someone who had grown up thinking that chemical management of consciousness was normal adult behavior. He began taking what his colleagues called nerve tonics to handle the stress of his new responsibilities, never understanding that he was following a path that had already been walked by thousands of young men from similar backgrounds. The transformation of William's personality was swift and devastating, though it was celebrated by everyone around him as evidence of his professional maturation. The anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized his early weeks on the job disappeared, replaced by the artificial confidence that laudanum provided. His natural caution about financial risks was overwhelmed by the grandiose thinking that chronic opiate use created. His ability to focus on complex details was replaced by the dreamy detachment that made him seem wise and contemplative to colleagues who were operating under similar chemical influences. Within 6 months, William had become one of the firm's most promising young employees, praised for his mature judgment and his ability to remain calm under pressure. But his apparent success was built entirely on pharmaceutical foundations that were systematically destroying his capacity for authentic professional development. He was learning to perform the role of a competent banker while being fundamentally incapable of the clear thinking that effective financial management required. The clients who trusted William with their investments were dealing with someone whose consciousness had been altered in ways that made rational risk assessment impossible. But his chemically induced confidence and apparent sophistication convinced them that they were working with a particularly gifted young financier. His early recommendations, made during periods of opiate-induced grandiosity, happened to coincide with favorable market conditions, creating a track record that reinforced everyone's belief in his exceptional abilities. But William's story was being repeated throughout London's financial district as an entire generation of young men from laudanum-dependent families entered the workforce, carrying with them the psychological patterns they had learned in childhood. They were predisposed to seek chemical solutions to professional stress, to interpret artificial confidence as genuine competence, and to mistake the performance of adult responsibility for authentic professional development. The result was a financial system increasingly dominated by people whose decision-making capacity had been compromised by addiction, though none of them understood this. The speculative investments, the overextended credit arrangements, and the increasingly complex financial instruments that would eventually contribute to economic instability were all products of minds that were operating under chemical influences that made sound judgment impossible. Meanwhile, the young women of this generation were facing their own unique challenges as they entered a marriage market where authentic emotional connection had become increasingly rare. Miss Catherine Fairmont, daughter of the laudanum-dependent couple whose artificial romance had been the talk of London society, was now 18 and making her debut into fashionable society. Catherine had grown up witnessing what she believed was an ideal marriage, never understanding that her parents' legendary devotion was actually a shared addiction that created the illusion of deep emotional connection while preventing genuine intimacy. She had learned to recognize the signs of true love as the intense feelings and passionate declarations that occurred when both partners achieved optimal chemical states simultaneously. Catherine's expectations for her own romantic life were shaped by these chemically manufactured models of intimacy. She was attracted to young men who displayed the artificial intensity and emotional grandiosity that characterized laudanum users during periods of intoxication. The quiet steadiness of unmedicated suitors seemed boring and emotionally shallow, compared to the dramatic passion she had learned to associate with genuine feeling. When Catherine met young Lord Edmund Blackwood at a fashionable garden party, she was immediately drawn to his passionate intensity and his ability to discuss poetry and philosophy with what seemed like extraordinary depth and sensitivity. Edmund's elaborate declarations of love, his emotional volatility, and his tendency toward grandiose romantic gestures seemed like evidence of a soul capable of the kind of transcendent love she had witnessed between her parents. But Edmund's romantic intensity was actually the result of the laudanum he had been taking since adolescence, for what doctors called artistic temperament. His passionate poetry was composed during periods of chemical euphoria. His emotional declarations were products of opiate-induced grandiosity, and his apparent sensitivity was actually the artificial empathy that characterizes chronic intoxication rather than genuine emotional depth. Catherine and Edmund's courtship was conducted entirely within the context of shared chemical alteration, creating an artificial intimacy that felt more profound than any relationship either had ever experienced. Their engagement was celebrated as a union between two souls of extraordinary sensitivity and depth. But it was actually a partnership between two people who were incapable of authentic emotional connection while believing they had found the deepest love possible. Their wedding was attended by the cream of London society, many of whom were experiencing their own chemically mediated emotions about the beautiful ceremony and the obvious devotion between the young couple. The tears shed during the service, the heartfelt toasts at the reception, and the general atmosphere of romantic celebration were all produced by people whose consciousness had been altered by substances that made genuine feeling impossible, while creating convincing simulations of authentic emotion. The marriage that followed was a tragedy disguised as a fairy tale. Catherine and Edmund experienced periods of intense connection during times when their chemical states aligned. But these moments alternated with periods of mutual incomprehension and irritation when their dosing schedules fell out of sync. They attributed their periodic disconnection to the natural rhythms of married life, never understanding that their capacity for intimacy existed only within narrow chemical parameters. Their attempts to have children were complicated by the effects of chronic laudanum use on fertility and reproductive health. Though their doctors attributed their difficulties to the nervous strain of modern life and prescribed additional medications to help them relax and improve their overall constitution. The treatments that were supposed to help them conceive actually made pregnancy less likely while increasing their chemical dependency. When Catherine finally did conceive, her pregnancy was managed by doctors who saw no contradiction between maintaining her daily laudanum regimen and protecting the health of her unborn child. The idea that substances taken by the mother might affect fetal development was simply not part of medical understanding during this period. Catherine continued her regular doses throughout pregnancy, interpreting the dreamy contentment they provided as evidence of the natural serenity that should accompany motherhood. The child born to Catherine and Edmund entered the world already affected by prenatal opiate exposure. Though no one at the time understood why little Margaret seemed so unusually fussy and difficult to comfort, the baby's withdrawal symptoms were interpreted as evidence of a naturally sensitive constitution that would require careful management throughout her life. The cycle was beginning again as a third generation prepared to grow up thinking that chemical dependency was normal family life. But by 1896, even Victorian society, as remarkable capacity for denial, was beginning to crack under the weight of evidence that something was systematically wrong with their civilization. The children who had grown up in laudanum-dependent households were now adults, and they were producing results that could not be explained away by theories about constitutional weakness or the stresses of modern life. The suicide rate among young adults from prominent families had increased dramatically, though no one connected these tragedies to the chemical dependencies that dominated their households. Young men and women who had grown up witnessing artificial emotions and chemically mediated relationships were finding themselves incapable of authentic connection or genuine purpose, leading to a despair that seemed to have no rational explanation. Miss Arabella Thornton, daughter of the working-class family whose laudanum dependency had destroyed their economic stability, had managed through extraordinary determination to educate herself and secure a position as a governess in a middle-class household. But Arabella carried with her the psychological scars of growing up in a home dominated by addiction, and she found herself unable to form the kind of stable relationships that her position required. Arabella's employers, the Worthington family, initially praised her dedication and her unusual ability to manage difficult children. What they didn't understand was that Arabella's skills came from a childhood spent navigating the unpredictable behaviors of chemically altered adults. She could read the subtle signs of mood changes, anticipate emotional volatility, and maintain her own equilibrium in chaotic situations because these had been survival skills she developed before age 10. But Arabella's hypervigilance and emotional detachment, while useful for managing her professional responsibilities, made it impossible for her to experience the kind of genuine warmth and connection that healthy relationships required. She performed the role of devoted governess while being fundamentally incapable of authentic emotional engagement with the children in her care. The Worthington children sensed something strange about their governess's emotional availability, though they couldn't articulate what made them uncomfortable. Arabella could provide excellent practical care, maintain perfect discipline, and even display appropriate affection when the situation called for it. But there was an artificial quality to her emotional responses that left the children feeling cared for, but not truly seen or understood. This pattern was being repeated throughout English society as the first generation of laudanum epidemic children entered adult roles. They brought with them survival skills that made them appear highly competent in professional and social situations. But these same skills were based on adaptations to dysfunction that made authentic human connection nearly impossible. The teaching profession was particularly affected by this phenomenon. Young women who had grown up in chemically altered households possessed an unusual ability to maintain classroom discipline and manage difficult students. But their teaching methods reflected the emotional detachment they had learned as survival mechanisms rather than genuine educational insight. Miss Dorothy Peyton, recently graduated from Teacher Training College, was assigned to one of London's most challenging elementary schools, where her ability to maintain order among unruly children quickly earned her a reputation as an exceptionally gifted educator. But Dorothy's classroom management skills came from a childhood spent managing the unpredictable moods of laudanum-dependent parents, not from any natural aptitude for teaching. Dorothy's students were learning not just academic subjects, but unconscious lessons about emotional regulation and human relationships, from someone whose own development had been distorted by growing up in a household dominated by chemical dependency. She was passing on patterns of emotional management that prioritized control over authentic expression, compliance over genuine engagement, and performance over authentic learning. The children in Dorothy's classroom were developing their understanding of authority, discipline, and educational relationships based on interactions with someone whose own emotional development had been systematically damaged by addiction-related trauma. They were learning to suppress their natural curiosity and emotional responsiveness in favor of the kind of mechanical compliance that Dorothy had learned was necessary for survival in unpredictable family situations. Meanwhile, the medical profession was facing its own crisis as doctors began to encounter patients whose symptoms didn't fit any of their existing theoretical frameworks. The children and young adults who had grown up in laudanum-dependent households were presenting with patterns of psychological distress that seemed to have no identifiable cause, leading to increasingly elaborate medical theories about hereditary nervous disorders and constitutional weaknesses. Dr. Mortimer Blackwood, son of the physician who had spent decades treating laudanum addiction as hereditary nervous diathesis, had inherited his father's practice, along with his theoretical assumptions about the nature of the conditions he was treating. But the younger Dr. Blackwood was encountering patients whose symptoms challenged everything he had been taught about nervous disorders and their treatment. Young adults like William Ashworth would arrive at Dr. Blackwood's office complaining of a persistent sense of emptiness and disconnection that no amount of laudanum seemed to address. They described feeling like they were watching their own lives from a distance, going through the motions of normal adult activities, while being unable to experience genuine satisfaction or meaning in anything they did. Dr. Blackwood interpreted these symptoms as evidence of an advanced form of nervous exhaustion that required more intensive pharmaceutical management. He prescribed increasingly complex regimens of laudanum, combined with other medications, never understanding that he was actually treating the psychological consequences of growing up in chemically altered households, with more of the same chemicals that had caused the original damage. The patients who sought Dr. Blackwood as help were trapped in a medical system that had no framework for understanding addiction or its intergenerational consequences. Their authentic psychological distress was being treated with more of the substances that had created their problems in the first place, creating a cycle of iatrogenic harm that seemed like compassionate medical care to everyone involved. But the most disturbing development was the emergence of what Cordelia privately termed the performance generation. Young adults who had become so skilled at mimicking authentic human behavior that they could maintain the appearance of normal social and professional functioning while being fundamentally disconnected from genuine human experience. These young people had learned to perform emotions they didn't feel, to simulate intimacy they couldn't experience, and to display competence in areas where they had no real understanding. They could conduct conversations, maintain relationships, and fulfill professional obligations with remarkable skill. But all of this apparent functionality was based on elaborate performances rather than authentic engagement with life. Lord Edmund Blackwood, despite his marriage to Catherine and his successful career in politics, was living in a state of profound psychological isolation that he couldn't articulate or understand. He could deliver passionate speeches about social justice, engage in sophisticated political negotiations, and maintain the appearance of a devoted marriage. But he experienced all of these activities as elaborate theatrical performances rather than genuine expressions of his beliefs or feelings. And so we return to Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, sitting in her drawing room in 1860, delicately sipping from her crystal glass. But now you understand what was really in that amber liquid, and you know the true cost of her daily ritual. She was just one face in a silent epidemic that consumed an entire civilization from within, turning medicine into poison and respectability into a mask for collective destruction. Victorian England's laudanum crisis reveals how easily a society can lose itself when it refuses to see the truth about the substances it embraces. Today, as we face our own struggles with prescription addiction and pharmaceutical dependency, perhaps we can finally learn from their tragedy and choose a different path.